Hello. This is a fun new adventure. Thank you to everyone who's decided to come along and see what this is about. So yeah, I guess for anyone who watches my regular videos, I do quite a lot of video game hacking, and there's quite a lot of boilerplate on the software engineering side that goes into that. You know, allocating remote threads and patching functions, and I've been thinking for a while. I'd like to build a toolkit which kind of abstracts away a lot of that, and makes it easier, hopefully, to produce videos a little bit quicker. And I thought it was something fun to do, and I've been wanting to mess around with live streaming a bit as well. So I thought it'd be fun to kind of bring those two together. So that's why I'm here today. So I'm going to start building a process hacking toolkit in this stream, and hopefully in future streams if people enjoy it. So it's going to be quite low level C++ and start off on Windows, but we'll see where we go. I have a long laundry list of features that I'd like to add, and absolutely zero plan on how to do this. I've got no design in mind. I'm just going to start writing code, see what happens, and then just refactor as we go along. So hopefully that is of some interest. So I've got a project I've already set up. I've called it, names are hard. I've called it Blind IO because a lot of this work kind of feels like just stumbling around in the dark, and I'm a bit of a Terry Pratchett fan, so it seemed like a good name, but might change in the future. We'll see what happens. So I've set up a pretty basic CMake project. I will also be pushing this to GitHub, so if anyone wants to have a look afterwards, they can. It's pretty basic setup. I've laid out the code kind of how I like to do a lot of these kind of projects, in that there's a library and an executable. The reason being that basically all the logic is going to live in the library, and the executable, like the command line tool, is just going to drive that library. The reason being is that if this is eventually of use to anyone, then they can either take the command line tool and use that, or they can take the library and directly embed that into their own program, their own project. So that's kind of how this is going to be laid out. The library itself just has at the moment a single function, which is message, with some of my best code, pretty simple implementation, and then the command line tool just consumes that. So this is kind of where we're starting with, and yeah, we're going to start writing some code and see what happens. So I think the first thing we need to do is to get a list of the PIDs of all the processes running on the box that we're on, because then that's kind of like the entry point into a lot of the Win32 functions. Is you get PID, and then you get handle, and then you can start doing more interesting things. So we're going to start off pretty basic. So I think we'll need a process utils file. And in that, it's always important in C++ to have a project name that shortens to something nice, so you don't have to do lots of typing when you declare your namespace. I think for this, let's have vector and my face is blocking the file explorer. Sorry. Okay, hang on. Real time debugging this. Maybe down here. Let's try down here and see what happens. Yeah, sorry if it looks like I'm not monitoring the chat. This is the first time I've done this, and there's now quite a lot on my screen, but I'm doing my best. We'll figure this out as we go along, step by step. So unt2 t get pids. So I think this is basically, yeah, that's better. Brilliant. Thanks for the feedback. I'm excited to do effectively live code reviews as well. Do tell me if anything doesn't make sense, or if you think my code is terrible, because it probably is, but it's it's fun to kind of go through with it with everyone. So I think we need a function which gets PIDs. I think that seems reasonably sensible place to start. So let's create a process util corresponding file, and then from that we can include the process utils, and then again namespace bio, and then I'll just copy that across, copy over my headers, and there we can start implementing it. So this will return an empty vector to start with. Let's make sure this gets built. Let's see how well I tested my setup before starting all this. Hopefully this builds, and all continues to run, so we still get hello world, which is, you know, pretty good starting point for any project. Hello world. So what we're going to be using is a Windows function called enum processes. So this retrieves the process This retrieves the process identifier for each process object in the system. So this is the official Windows way of getting a list of all the PIDs. We're going to be reading quite a lot of Windows documentation for this. It's more interesting than it sounds, or at least to me, because there's a lot of oddities and curios in how Windows software has evolved over time, and we're going to kind of do our best to fully embrace and conform to the restrictions and curios that Windows had provided us. So the function takes 3 arguments. The first one is a pointer to an array that retrieves the list of process identifiers. So this is an array of dwords which is going to receive all of the PIDs. The second argument is the size of that array, but it's in bytes, which is kind of a bit strange. So it's not the number of elements in the array. You have to make sure that you multiply that by the size of dword, otherwise it will be wrong. And then it will out variable, it will return you the number of bytes that it's put into that array. Again, not the number of elements, it's the number of bytes. If the function succeeds, the value is non-zero. If the function fails, the return value is 0. It says bool, but then it talks about numbers. Sure, that's fine, we can work with that. And then I love the remark section in all the Win32 APIs, because there's always a few hidden gems in there. It is a good idea to use a large array because it is hard to predict how many processes there will be at the time you call enum processes. Fair enough. To determine how many processes were enumerated, divide the LPCB needed value by the size of dword. There is no indication given when the buffer is too small to store all processes identifiers. Therefore, if LPCB needed equals CB, consider retrying the call with a larger array. So the official way that Windows provides you to get all the PIDs on your system will not tell you how many PIDs there are. It will just keep filling up your array, and if it fills it fully up, then good luck, because Windows just suggests you call that function again with a bigger array. So we're gonna try and handle all of this in code, because you know, I think it's important to try and get these things right. Another point is that starting from Windows 7, the PS API, which is where this function lives, changed, and so it's now actually called K32 enum processes. So the docs say this process, this function, which is actually not called this function, takes an array, but you also have to think in bytes, and will not actually tell you how much data it returns. You kind of have to figure that out for yourself as you go along. Sure. You know what? Let's start writing some code. So what are we going to do? Oh, it probably helps if I actually include Windows. Windows.h, and then I need to also include, what is it, the psapi.h, sorry, psapi.h. Right, so that should bring in most of the Windows chuff that we need. I'll just keep the chat window up. Right, so, and my code is gone. Right, dword PIDs. So we need to effectively want to call if K32 enum processes, and then we can give it the PIDs.data, so that's the array, and then PIDs dot size, that's the number of elements, don't forget to times by the size of dword. I guess we could use decal type to pull out the type from PIDs, but I think it's easy just to type dword. And then, oh yeah, we need to somewhere for it to store the number of bytes that it returned. So, and then we can do bytes returned, and then if that equals 0, then everything has gone wrong, and we will throw. Can't type when other people are watching, which is great for live streaming. Throw stood runtime error failed to get PIDs. So a lot of people complain about Microsoft API. I think any large bit of software is complex, especially if it's going for a long time. So it does pick up a few quirks along the way. But yeah, there's a few oddities to programming on Windows, which I think is fun. But I guess, maybe I guess it depends how many bugs you have and how many production issues you cause. So I think something to note to draw attention to here is that, for me personally, I think it's important to communicate your public API in terms of like fundamental and vocabulary types. So, the fixed width integers, optionals, variants, those kind of things. Because this means that, because we could return a vector of dwords, and that's absolutely fine because that's what the API says it's going to give us. But when we come to port this to Linux in the future, that won't work because dword is a Microsoft construct. It doesn't exist. And having ported a large Windows code base to Linux before in the past, I can tell you that if all your APIs are just talk in terms of types that are just available in C++, it makes your life a lot easier. Having said that, I do think it's important to communicate with the Windows API in terms of the types that it is expecting. We should speak its language and then convert those to whatever language we want to speak outside, which is basically the point of abstraction, right? We bury all the misery that is interacting with this API and the Win32 API behind this nice, simple API. So, I saw someone mention certificate managers and crypto in Windows. I don't know if we'll get onto that. That's a whole different kettle of fish. I've used like Cappy before and the Windows Crypt API. It's very strange. A lot of times the documentation does not match up to the requirements, as into like what it provides you, which kind of really a bit out of luck at that point. Anyway, so let's handle the case where we actually need to call this multiple times, because again, Windows won't tell us how many PIDs there are. We kind of have to guess. So while let's see, bytes returned equals PIDs dot size over size of dword. So I'm gonna have to give this an initial amount as well. So let's pick a nice round number, 1024. So this will basically format. So this will try and collect 1024 PIDs, and then every time it fills that array up, it will try again, which means we need to, on each iteration, PIDs.resize PIDs.size times 2. So it'll exponentially grow this buffer, which is a pretty standard strategy for these kind of things. So we're going to keep doubling that buffer and try and fill it until we don't fill it completely. And at that point, we know, well, we're reasonably sure there are no more PIDs because Windows has told us that. How long have I been programming in general? I've been programming professionally in C++ and a few other languages for about a decade, but I think I started programming when I was like 14 or 15. PHP was my first language, PHP 4, before I moved on to other things, so it still holds there's a certain place in my heart that I hold dear, PHP, despite what everyone says about it. Not that I've used it probably since university, but yeah. So I've been making and breaking software for about a decade now. Okay, so I think that's right. We're going to give it a go in a minute. So now we need to take this vector of d words and convert that into a vector of uint32t's, which can't just return one vector as another and have it convert. We could loop through and copy them across, but I think instead we will use some modern C++ and try it with ranges. So let's try return PIDs, pipe that to stirred views transform, and then this is going to take one of our PIDs and we can return. So we can use this to effectively transform each element in the vector to something else. So by this code at the moment doesn't actually do any transformation, it just takes the value and return it. So we could static cast this to a uint32t, but if we just we say this lambda's return type is uint32t, then the compiler will just sort out the rest for it, and it will allow the implicit cast, which will then kind of make this work. And then the final thing is to take this range and actually reify it back into a vector. So we can use 2 and then vector, and then so I think that's right. Let me just close this. Let's do some bookkeeping. So I really like Clang format. I think it's a really good tool, but it's not perfect, and it really doesn't understand ranges like at all. So what we have to do is cheat and put some comments here, and this should stop it like trying to compress it all into one long line, because when you start getting loads and loads of ranges, like when you're piping lots and stuff into each other, that Clang format will just try and put it all on one line and it becomes instantly unreadable. Have I made a mistake? Oh, good spot, thank you. Live code review. Okay, we've written some code. Let's see if it blends. Classic. So I've got the Windows equivalent of all on, so that's w4. Can't remember. Conversion type because there's a narrowing. So let's just be a bit more explicit around that, because sometimes you just need a little bit more, a few more casts. All right. Oh, thanks, Clang format. Oh, that's what I really wanted. I really wanted that 0 on its own line. Unless I've made a mistake somewhere. Okay, so that blends. Close this down. Is there a reason to write everything in if parentheses? Why not just create a variable? You could. There's literally no reason you couldn't. I know that I don't want this return value to be used anywhere outside of this if statement. So it's just more typing if I assign it to a variable and then check it, especially when I don't need it beyond that. But dealer's choice, right? In fact, actually, sometimes it is worth sticking in variables, because then it makes debugging easier, because you've then got something you can inspect in your debugger. But I suspect the compiler will flatten both down to pretty much the same code. So let's try and see if this works. So what do I call it? Process. That's why I see if I set up my CMake correctly. Thank you. Right. So for const auto pid in bio get pids stirred print line pid. Right. Okay, let's run that, and I get a whole bunch of pids and quite a lot of zeros. Where have we gone wrong? Let's go back. I've seen the issue. we keep looping until our array is not fully filled, which means we basically filled up some subset of this array, but we're still returning the whole array. We need to restrict this down to just the ones that we know we returned. I hope that makes sense. I use what keyboard do I use? I use a Corsair. I was not anticipating this question. I use this here is what I use. K70 RGB Mach 2. And I have it so it gives me nice purple lights because I like the colour purple. Right, I think we need... There's pretty much nothing that you can't fix with more ranges. So let's do... Is it stood views take, I think is the correct incantation. And then we're going to do bytes returned. And then this time we do want to divide by the size of a D word. Because... Careful, steady. Because this will now take only the first number of elements that were actually returned. PID0 has a special meaning in Windows. I think it's like a system process. I don't think it's quite the same as like PID1 in Linux, but it does have a special meaning. But the reason it's returning 000 is not because it's found that PID over and over again. It's because every time I resize this, it will grow the array, and then it will value initialize all the elements, which is a 0 initializer for an integer type, which means it will fill it with zeros. I'm not a language lawyer, don't quote me on that, but it will definitely fill it with zeros. So let's give this a go. Brilliant. Okay. Lots of PIDs. Right, we're on to something now. Do I have any book recommendations for software engineers to get into reversing hacking? No, because I've never read a book on that. I just kind of wrote software and then had a look at how it worked under the hood and kind of learnt from there. If anyone is familiar, I'm sure most people are familiar with Godbolt, but it is... Hang on. How do I reset? But this is a great tool for writing code, and then you can select the compiler you want, and then it will show you the assembly, so you can kind of start to see how stuff works under the hood. There are some other resources. Maybe I can kind of go through those at a later date, or maybe do like a community post on those, because there's more to it than just writing software and seeing the assembly output. If you're kind of interested in binary exploitation, maybe we can kind of go through those at a later stage. Right, what's next? Okay, so I think now we want to start building out a bit of an abstraction. We want to be able to take that PID, put it in a class, and then through adding methods to that class, we can start to interact with that process. So let's create a process.h and then class process, and then this will have a public constructor which will take our uint32t PID, and then private that will stood uint32t that will store the PID, and then we can have a getter, so stood uint32t PID pod const. And then I think as well, we will have a string name. So I think this is kind of what we should be aiming for to start with. So the name will be the name of the process that was launched. So probably something like Firefox XE or something like that. Oh, how you would tell the difference between the value initialized 0 and genuine 0? You wouldn't. Like, just good luck. You can kind of tell that the zeros at the end aren't what you want, because it tells you how many bytes you wrote, and you can kind of work out where the end of your array is. But any zeros within that could possibly be valid. I'd have to look up the specific documentation for like PID 0 in Windows and what it means. But yeah, hopefully that kind of answers your question. New file, process.cpp. Is the text big enough? I guess I should have asked that at the beginning. Can everyone see this, or do I need to embiggen it? Obviously, I'm happy to make it bigger so more people can see, but then there's less I can kind of write in one go, but we'll see what happens. Does PID need to be const? No, I try to avoid const members because it has implications on the class. It means the class itself is inherently non-copyable because you can't duplicate it, and there's some other oddities around it. So I tend to avoid const members where possible. You're better off just constraining it at the API level. Text is good. Brilliant. Let's keep going. So process.h, name all this good stuff, and then we want some headers. I like to include. I think it's good practice to include what you use rather than relying on coming from the header, because then you get into the issue of transient includes, and then you remove a header and you didn't realize that was bringing in something you needed. So you'll see me typing out all the headers I need, like quite a lot. So process u PID, and then we're going to wang that into a PID. Text seems good down to even. Slightly embiggen will be good, but it's readable. Well, I'll tell you what. Let's try this out. Let's try going one bigger, and we'll see how it goes. And if I find this totally unusable, we can maybe reduce it again. But this doesn't seem too bad. It's actually probably more important that everyone else reads it than I do. And then we had some methods, didn't we? Stirred u32t process PID const return PID, and then stirred string process name const return tbc. Get that in there at some point. String include. Right, so let's add that to the I'm a sucker for things being in alphabetical order. Let's see if this blends. Hopefully I haven't done anything outrageous. Over there. Oh, have I missed a con? What am I doing wrong? Is this string name? Strange. What have I? Clearly missing something here. Message. I might have to just make this a little bit smaller so I can read the error message. Oh, hang on. That's because I've typoed that for a start. And then university. Was that it? Okay, fine. That was it. Definitely want, again, like in the grand scheme of things, the difference between signed and unsigned for a PID type doesn't really mean much, because I don't think your PID will ever get beyond the size of a maximum signed integer. But semantically, it does make a difference, because you can never have a negative PID, so why would you even allow that possibility? That's just kind of like how I view these things. Okay, I'm hoping these red squiggles disappear at some point. Okay, so the next thing we're going to want to do is get the name. So back to the docs. This enum process page actually has a link to enumerating all processes. So this, Windows kind of gives you the code that you need to, the runes that you need to in order to get this. I think there's quite a few ways of getting the name of the PID, but let's just go with this because this is what we've got. So the first thing we need to do is open the process. This gives you a handle to it, and the handle is actually the way that you interact with processes within the Win32 API. So we'll open the process. We will then, and I'll go through like enum process modules and get a module base name in a second, and then at the end of it we'll need to close the handle. So the thing here is that in my mind, whenever we have like a yin and a yang, like a do and an undo, that should be encapsulated into an RAI class. So RAI, resource acquisition is initialization, is a C++ idiom for automatically handling like lifetimes of objects and making sure they get correctly cleaned up. Vector is an RAI class because when it goes out of scope, it deletes all your memory. Unique pointer is an RAI class because when it gets out of scope, it deletes the object. So I think before we continue, we should make some sort of primitive that allows us to RAI up handles, but we can, I think we can make this a little bit fun. We can kind of make it a little bit more generic. I'm going to create a file which I end up creating in most of my projects called AutoRelease. So AutoRelease will be a object that owns a resource, which would be like like a handle to something. So that could be a process handle, it could be a socket handle, normally some sort of integer type, but will also store along with it the function that is used to clean it up. And then when it goes out of scope, it will automatically call that function on that object. Hopefully that makes sense. If not, we're going to start writing some code and we'll see where we get to. RAI isn't just C++. I think anything where you have a do and an undo in a constructor and a destructor, is viable. Sounds like a good idea in any language, but it's very much, that particular acronym is very much associated with C++. I couldn't speak to other languages and the terminology they use. So let's start writing some of this. So namespace bio. Gonna first stream jumping straight into templates. So basically what I want is to be able to supply some sort of invalid value that is kind of part of the type. So if you think, if anyone's done a Unix socket program before, when you create a socket, you'll get back a file descriptor, which is an integer, and that is -1 if it's invalid. So I'd quite like to be able to sort of say something like AutoRelease int -1, and that way when I assign a socket and put it inside this container class, it already knows what the invalid value is, so it will make sure it won't call the deleter function if it's invalid. So that's kind of my thought process with this. Doesn't have to be a template type, but templates are fun. So let's have a look at this. So t_obj, and then I'm not that fussed about performance at the moment, so let's use a std function, which takes it'll return nothing, take a t, and that will be the we'll call that the deleter. We'll make that null pointer. Actually, it's a header, so, and then let's make that explicit as well because all my code disappeared. Let's make that explicit as well because of the defaulted argument. Sometimes you might just be passing one argument to it. So we're going to want to store some data. So we're going to want a t_obj, and then we're going to want a std function void. I suppose I could alias that, but what are you going to do? So the crux of this now is that when we have the destructor, we can basically say if obj does not equal invalid and we were supplied deleter, then deleter obj. So why do you use pragma instead of hash define? Pragma is non-standardized C++ for header guard, but every compiler supports it slightly differently in some cases, but by and large, I think in terms of like non-standardized code, pragma once is probably the only one I will ever use. But yeah, I just think it's less typing than header guards, which are kind of a bit error prone because you need 3 lines, you need 2 at the top and 1 at the bottom. They're absolutely prone to copy and paste errors because it's so easy just to copy and paste one from another file you've already got, because who wants to write those 3 lines? And then pragma once is a lot easier. What VS Code theme am I using? That is a great question, and it is my favorite theme is Dracula, draculatheme.com. One, I really like pink and purple, so it suits me fine, but also secondly, it has support for a crazy number of applications, and I really value consistency, especially in my dev environment. So it's really surprisingly important for me to have all my tools look the same, and then that's why I really like Dracula, because one, it's the colors I like, and two, I can get it on pretty much everything. So yeah, it's a good theme. And then now, back to some actual coding. We can store the object and then store the deleter. And then I think what will... So this is the... I mean, this won't work. This is the start of the bare minimum. So we're going to start basically just fleshing this out a little bit. I think we should have an empty case. So you can just create an empty auto release. It might be useful in some situations. So this will... So this will, if you call auto release without any arguments, it will actually then forward that call to this constructor, but it will pass in the invalid value. So you'll by default get an auto release in an invalid state. We'll probably need to add a resets method later so you can actually replace that, but I think this is kind of fine to good. It's kind of good to have objects default constructible where possible, because then it's, you know, it can make it easier to use it in certain containers. Why write implementation code in the header file? Because it's a template, and just to do with the curios of how C++ is implemented in terms of like how a compiler actually has to churn through the code. You have to have the implementation details in the header, so each translation unit can see the full template definition. If you were to move this code over to a CPP file, then each translation unit wouldn't have enough details to be able to instantiate the templates. So yeah, header files, all template code goes into a header file. I mean, you can kind of work around it if you're explicit about the types, but I think it's fair to say that template code goes in the header file. There's another question that I saw. Appending underscore to class member names looks original. Where does it come from? So like, why does like STL have like STL underscore react and STL underscore some function? That's C. C doesn't have the concept of namespaces, so the only way to do it, so the only way to write your code in such a way that you avoid clashing with other potential names from other projects is to manually preface all your types with a namespace. Whereas C++, this is a first class feature of the language, so you don't have to do that. You just put it in a namespace and then the compiler takes care of the rest. So let's add a few more methods before we get on to the interesting part of this class, which is how you handle transferring of resources. So const, let's actually be able to get the object out, and then I'm gonna add a cast operator, which also returns the object, and this will be important later because by adding this, you can then use this class in places where that type is expected. So it means we can pass this class, which is wrapping something, straight into a Win32 function, and then the compiler will just make sure that the internal value it's storing is the one that gets passed. Cast operators, you know, bit hit and miss. Like, it's quite easy to shoot yourself in the foot with them, but I think this is a totally valid use case for it. And then let's just quickly add some equality operators. So const AutoRelease const equals default. Let's get the compiler to generate that for us. And then void swap. So we will need swap in a second. So let's create that. So I'm going to include ranges now, which might seem like a strange thing to include, but it will hopefully make sense in a minute. When you used to have to create a swap method, you used to have to, like, was it using names? I can't remember. There's like std swap, or there's like some extra step you had to go to. It's called, I can't remember what it's called. It's something like two-phase swapping or something like that. And the idea being that because of some of the historic complexities of C++, there's this thing called argument-dependent lookup. So if you wanted to swap member variables and the compiler couldn't immediately see where a swap implementation for that was, it was allowed to reach out into the surrounding namespaces. But to enable that and to make sure it still found the standard ones, you had to do some like boilerplate stuff. But that has all gone away with ranges, so I can just do std ranges. Swap obj other dot obj and get that in a minute. Deleter and then deleter. So this will just create a swap method for that. And then I guess to be fully complete, we should create a freeform function as well, so that other swap methods can find us. AutoRelease t invalid r2, and then we should be able to just do r1 dot swap r2. Okay. So back to the last sort of salient points of this class before we actually get back onto doing some actual coding. We want to disable copying, both types, because we will this class is effectively going to be the owner of this object. It should be the single owner, very much like a unique pointer. So if you can copy it around, then when your copies go out of scope, they will try and delete the object, which isn't ideal because then you'll end up with the equivalent of a dangling reference. So by disabling copying, it means that this, when we instantiate this auto-release with an object, this will be the sole owner of it. However, we still might need to transfer what's called transfer ownership of that. We still might need to be able to like hand that over to someone else when we no longer need it. So we do that with the move constructor and the move assignment operator. So auto-release. So this will be called when someone is constructing us with an R-value reference, and not going to go fully into all the value categories now, but this is basically an object from which we can steal the resources for because it's no longer needed afterwards. So that's either the return value of a function, a PR value, or the result of std move, an X value, like an expiring value. So we want to basically default construct ourselves first, and then we should be able to just swap with other. So at this point here, once we've called this, we are in like an invalid state, which is why we have this. And then we basically steal the resources from the one that's been passed into us, because we know semantically that if someone's called this, then whatever they're passing to us is no longer needed. And this will take our invalid values, stick it in other, take others' values, and stick it in ours. When you do this kind of thing, I believe the standard uses the phrase left in a valid but unknown state. So you can destruct it and probably assign something new to it, but kind of all bets are off of what state it's left in after that. So then we have one more to do, which is the assignment operator, the move assignment operator. So I'm missing an equal sign. This has one more level of complexity to it than this, because this will be called on an object that has already been instantiated. So let's say AR equals AR, as in AutoRelease, I can't bother to type it out, equals and then later on we do B equals move A. So this says I want to transfer ownership of this object into this one, but this one already could potentially be managing an object, so we need to make sure we delete and clean up anything we currently manage before we take ownership of the new one. That's kind of the only gotcha in this. So if we create a new AutoRelease object and move the other into it, and then so this will effectively hollow out, this will call this, which we just discussed, and we'll basically transfer this into it. So this after this line, other is hollowed out, it's left in a valid but unknown state, and we now have ownership of this. And then if we swap ourselves with new object and then return this, so this is the key part here. By swapping ourselves with this one, after this line, we now own other because it's gone into this object and then gone to ours, but crucially anything we did own is now in new object, and when it reaches the end of the scope, it will, because of RAII, it will automatically clean itself up. So at the end of this function, we will have taken control of other, we would have freed up anything we did already own, and other will be left in a valid but unknown state. So that's kind of like an easy-ish way to implement this. I think that's, pretty sure that's right. So back to some more Windows programming. What's next? We want to start building out process. So okay, so now that we have this AutoRelease primitive, we can start to like use it and make use of it. Windows.h. So I know, like I just know that we were going to want to have a handle to this process. But again, by just storing a handle here, I have to remember to close it when I no longer need it, and I have to handle copying it and ownership. So instead, we can just wrap this in an AutoRelease handle, and believe, because the defaulted template, that will work with the invalid handle, because an invalid handle is null. Yeah, so now this class automatically gets that functionality. So when this class goes out of scope, it will call the destructor on all of its members, which will call the destructor on AutoRelease, which will cause that to go away. And this will also effectively make this process non-copyable for us, because if a member variable is non-copyable, then the class itself is non-copyable, because you shouldn't be able to bypass that. Hopefully that makes sense. If it sounds like I'm speaking nonsense, leave a comment. I'm happy to try and explain more of this as I go along. But now, what do I plan to use for this? Yes, so I want to use this to try and streamline the videos that I create normally on the channel. So like the reverse engineering and hacking games. A lot of the stuff I have to do involves finding a process and then using the Win32 API to interact with it, and it's a lot of boilerplate. I end up having to copy this file around a lot, and I thought it'd be kind of fun to create a framework or a toolkit that abstracts away a lot of the boilerplate, so it was easy for me to kind of interact with other processes. But also, I thought kind of just fun to build as well. It's kind of fun to go through some of the low-level stuff and mess around with the Win32 API. I'd like to port this to Linux as well. Maybe probably do that on the stream at some point. So yeah, handles. So I want to take my handle and I want to call open process. So if we go back to our documents, it says you need to call open process, which will opens an existing local process object, and you give it the level of access you want, something about whether you inherit handles or not, which we're not that fussed about, and then the PID. So this is how you get a handle from a PID and allows you to then communicate with that process. I don't think there's anything particularly egregious or upsetting in this docs. It does tell you when you finish with the handle, make sure you call close handle, which was our little auto-release adventure. So call open process, and we need to give it some permissions. So the permissions are an ORD set list from the access rights. So there's a whole bunch here. I'm not going to go through them all. I'm just going to pick the two that I know I need, but you could kind of read through all these if you're curious to know what you want. This basically just says what permissions this handle has on the process that it's opening. So I want process query information, so this will allow you to query the process, and I also want process VM read, so this will allow you to read memory from the process, and this will be needed to get the, if I remember correctly, this will be needed to get the name of the process because it's effectively reading memory from that process. I think 0 and -1 are both invalid for handle. You very well could be right. If I go to open process, if open process fails, the return value is null. So that's kind of I can only go on the docs that Microsoft give me. Microsoft have a lot of docs, so you might not like what they've written, but they sure have written a lot of it. So there's normally the answer there. It's just quite a lot to read through. And then I don't want follow-on processes to inherit this handle. It's really not that important either way. And then passing the PID. But then crucially now we can pass in close handle to this function. Didn't even check that build. There you go. Right. So I don't know why I've got these red squiggles. I don't know why it's having a funny 5 moments. I'm pretty sure I've included everything. Oh well, anyway, problem for another day. So yeah, so now because of this little wrapper that we've built, we can open a process and then we can pass it the close handle, and it'll automatically call that for us when it goes out of scope. Okay, so and then all I'm going to do now is except I'm basically going to say if, oh hang on, I've missed, okay fine, let's do it this way. If not handle, then throw stood runtime error failed to open process, because that's a class invariant, right? We want this class to only be valid if it could open the process. Now this is definitely going to be an error because there's something I've missed. Oh no, or did I? Awkward. Did we do it? Anyway, I'll add the bit that I know I'm missing anyway. I want to add explicit operator bool const, which basically returns if obj doesn't equal invalid. So the idea behind that is this allows us now pass it into if statements and while loops and stuff like that, and allows us to sort of pragmatically check its I think the standard says it's contextually convertible to bool, which means you can't assign it to a bool, but you can use it in places where you would use a bool, like a condition statement. That's a process. Maybe process.h is also a header from the WinAP. Quite possibly. It does blend though, so it can't be that unhappy with it. IntelliSense, which is the thing that produces the red lines, is not perfect. If I remember correctly, it's like I think it's like a stripped down version of the MSVC compiler, so it's faster and doesn't have all the like the optimizing pass and all the bells and whistles, but it does sometimes get a little bit confused. I'm sure we can deal with it. So yeah, so if the handle is invalid, then we'll throw an exception. So this class is kind of interesting in itself anyway, because it's not representing like a snapshot of a process, it's representing a view onto a real running process, because that's how we're going to interact with it. So the class invariant, like the thing that must hold is that this is backed by a real process, which is all very well and good saying that, but someone could kill the process this is representing like any time. Someone could just kill Firefox if this was pointing at Firefox. So we will have to do a fair amount of error handling and checking as we go along, because at any point this class just could become invalid under our feet. So name. So if we go back to what Windows said we should use the enum process modules. So we'll get the docs up for that and see what hilarity ensues in there. Retrieve a handle for each model in the specified process. So a module is a exe or a DLL. So an executable will load multiple DLLs, so it will have multiple modules. So when you go through all the modules, you're effectively going through all the libraries that it's loaded. However, the first module in the module list is the executable itself. So what we're going to do is we're effectively going to enum process modules, but we're only going to enumerate up to the first element, because that will be the executable itself. So it takes a handle to the process. Again, that's why we have a handle. It takes an array that receives the list of module handles. So this is where we're going to store the retrieved values. The size of the module array, again in bytes, got to watch out for that. Sometimes it's number of elements, sometimes it's bytes. And then it will give us the number of bytes required to store all modules. If the function succeeds, the return value is non-zero. If the function fails, the return value is 0. This function is primarily designed for debuggers and similar applications. I think it might be cool to maybe extend this to be like a basic debugger as well. That's something we could take this, to actually interact with processes as they're running. But again, I've got a long laundry list of features I'd like to add, and pretty much zero plan on how to add any of them. Again, watch out, because it's not actually called this anymore. It's called the K32 enum process modules. I don't think there's some chuff in here about 32 bits and WoW 64. I think we're just going to focus on 64-bit. Like, let's get something working, and then we can kind of extend it later. So we need to call this function. So let's check that I've got hash include the psapi.h, right? So we're going to want to get I'll start again. What does enum process modules return? It returns an H module. So Windows loves its Hungarian notation, and they're all, you can tell it's Windows code because they're all really angry uppercase letters, like type names. I always feel like Windows is slightly shouting at me for wanting to use its API. So this will return a H module. So we're going to get that. And the H here means handle. So we're going to call that module. Just default initialize it. Oh, that shouldn't be pink. It thinks it's, oh, it's gone now. It's module is now keyword in C++20 for modules, but the support isn't quite there yet, so we'll stick with it for the moment. And then I'm going to want, again, it's got a D word, bytes needed equals not, and then if K32 enum process modules. It takes our handle. So this is why we have the cast operator for our auto release. It means we can just pass in our handle here, and we don't have to call .get or anything on it. It's just it will just work. Can you increase your audio volume? Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think I believe that's something I can do. Nope, it's on max. I don't know. I've never been asked this question before in OBS. It's awkward. Properties. Maybe if I just get really, like, we can start an ASMR channel. I can just get really close to it. Let me know if that is any better. I can try and project my voice a little bit more forcefully, but the audio slider is up to max, unless there's a window setting I'm missing. This all seems to be up for max. Something to... Can I increase the gain on the mic? No. Something to try and fix for last time. Hopefully people can hear. Maybe just I can add a gain. I wasn't expecting to be live debugging OBS through this. What I'm terrified of is that I'm going to do something which means it disappears entirely. Filters, gain. All right, I'm gonna whack this up to 5. How is that? Is that? I'm sure there is a window setting. The one I did see was max. So. I've added a gain. That is what I've done. Are we feeling the gain? Perfect. One person said perfect. Okay, that sounds pretty good. Apologies. I'd say we fix it in post, but this is live. My plan for this is to, if it makes sense, cut this up into an actual video, which has just got, like, you know, the meat and potatoes of the content. The is much quieter than that. Okay, up the gain to 10. I'm happy to, let's boost it one more time, and then I'll go back to chatting what I was going to chat about. Unchanged. I just can't win. Just can't win. Right. Okay. I've gained it more. If that is still inaudible, maybe the problem is your speakers. Anyway, the kind of videos that I produce normally take quite a long time to do. Like, it easily takes 3 to 4 weeks for me to produce a video. So I'm kind of hoping that by, you know, trying out live streaming and like cutting those live streams up into actual videos, it might allow me to produce a little bit more content, a little bit more frequently, as well as, you know, something to have in between, the bigger videos. A lot better. Majority says good. I'm going to continue writing some code. I feel audio mixing can now be kind of left up to the audience. Where was that? Yeah, so anyway, this is why we have the cast operator. It allows us just to pass this handle object straight into the Win32 API, and the compiler will automatically pull out the internal value. And then we need to store... Oh, it's gone. Then we need to poke this somewhere. So we're going to stick that into module, and then size of... What's the size of the array in bytes, right? So size of module. And then somewhere to stick the number of bytes that it read out. Bytes needed. So if that equals 0, then we've had a bad time. Throw std runtime error failed to get first module. I've already got to accept. Right. So this is a little trick you can do. The API wants an array that you will write all those all of its results into, but I know I only want one, and I'm going to tell it that I only want one. So you can just give it the address of a single variable, and the address of a variable is the equivalent of. So this will give it a pointer to this variable, which is the equivalent of an array of one element. So we should say, hey, just write this, the result of this, straight into here, and then the size of is just the size of that object. Okay, so then we're going to need some strings, which we've already got included. String, right. Well, actually, before we go on to that, let's actually look at what the docs say rather than blindly guessing. So back to our little Windows approved tutorial. Well, it's not tutorial. Example. You then, once you have your module handle, you can then say, hey, get the module base name, and that is the string we want. That is the name of the executable. So what does this say we need to do? Retrieves the base name of the specified module. So give a handle to the process that contains the module. So this is our that's our process. You then give it a handle to the module, so it's H module, and then a pointer to the buffer that receives the base name of the module. If the base name is longer than the maximum number of characters specified by n size, the base name is truncated. So you're going to give it a pointer, you're going to give it an address for it to write the string name of the module, and you're going to tell it how many characters it can write up to, and it's basically going to write up to that point, and if it can't write anymore, it will truncate it. Again, return 0 on failure. Primary use for debuggers, blah, blah, blah. I don't think there's, again, not actually called get module base name, it's called K32 module base name. I don't think there's a lot in here that's of interest. Basically, it's the classic issue is you can't ask it ahead of time how many characters it's going to need to write the name. You just have to give it a big buffer and hope for the best. But there's a little trick we can do in this case in order to make sure that we have enough space. So string module name. So we can give it a string that is the max path in length. So the maximum path is a Windows define, which it stores the largest a path can be on Windows. So it's the maximum number of characters that any path can be. So we would hope that the path the file name for this executable must be less than the maximum possible path you can represent on Windows. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a valid name. So we basically just say, we're going to write into that many bytes, and then we'll just trim off the end. Can't the path now be bigger up to 32,000 characters? Possibly. I'm sure I've read that somewhere, but if someone's got an executable name that's 32,000 characters long, I mean, maybe we just don't touch that one. Again, we can kind of come back and improve this as we go along. I'm just trying to get us to the point where we've kind of got something working and trying to handle as many of the Win32 curios as we go along, but we might miss a few along the way. So const auto. So what does get my function back? This returns, if the function succeeds, the return value specifies the length of the string copied to the buffer. So we'll get back how many characters we wrote. So that would be Charles written equals K32 get module base name A. We want the ASCII one, not the string one. I think we pass that. Sorry, I've got the docs up on the another window to get the handle, which again, cast operator, we can pass that straight in. Pass in our module. Pass in our module name dot data. So that'll be a pointer to the data, and then module name dot size. So how many bytes that we're going to return, and then after this, let's close that down. Then after this, well, actually no, I lie. We need first if Charles written equals 0. So earlier on, when someone said, why would you ever call it in the if statement and not assign it to a variable? This is the time you would assign it to a variable, because I need to, not only do I need to check it, I will actually then need to use that variable, that data later on to truncate my string. So throw std runtime error, failed to get, nope, failed to get module base name. And now that everything is all good, we can do module name dot resize in here, Charles written, and return module name. Right, okay, I think, let's see if that blends. I've missed something. Ugh. Every time. I'm a terrible typist. Right, okay, so that blends. So now, well, we should go and try this. Right, it's all very good writing code, but it's no good if it doesn't work. So let's include process.h. And then, so we're going to get our PIDs, and then we're going to go try bio process proc PID std print line proc. So we're going to go that, and then that, and then we can do proc.pid proc.name. Yes, you're right. That you are entirely correct, compiler. I should definitely add a catch clause to that. Std accept, and then we're going to go catch the runtime error if one was produced, and then we're going to do nothing with it, because that was, it might just be that we don't have, we're going to get all the PIDs and we're going to try and construct our process object around it, but again, it might very well be the case that this fails because we just don't have permission. It might be an elevated process. Just because we have the PID for it doesn't mean we can actually then open it and interact with it. So it's very possible that we would fail to construct this class, and then even down here these might fail. So we're going to kind of wrap that up in that. So if I run this, I can hopefully leak information to everyone about all the processes I'm running. Yep, there we go. So they're all the PIDs and they're all the process names. So now we can enumerate all the processes on the box and get their name. There's one more thing I want to do tonight on this stream, is that it's kind of using exceptions for control flow, like kind of is, kind of isn't. It depends how you view it, but like this is not the code that I want the user to have to worry about. So let's add like one more abstraction to kind of hide this away a little bit. So let's go back to process utils, and we're going to bring in our process abstraction, and then std vector, I think that's right. Find process. In fact, I want a string view. So let's give the user the ability to search for a process by name and get all the processes that match that. Again, I think we saw in that list, like there might be multiple PIDs for a given name, like Firefox will just spin up a whole bunch of processes. So let's get it so we can say, hey, give me all the PIDs that match Firefox.exe. Okay, I think we're nearly there. in terms of what we want to do. Oh, I'm glad you enjoyed the videos. Thank you very much. I must admit, like, just started YouTube on a bit of a whim, and it's taken off way more than I ever thought it would. And I quite enjoying doing it. I've got no plans of stopping at the moment. Am I planning on integrating this into R2 or just having it as a separate program? So R2 or RAII or RAII 2 is a reverse engineering toolkit. There's a Google search for it. No, I'm planning on having this entirely standalone. I'd quite like to make this just like a self-contained thing that we kind of build together live over however long it takes, and just keep iteratively adding to it and kind of give everyone a chance to get a bit of an insight into low-level C++ development and low-level like OS interactions. So yeah, standalone, but it'll be on GitHub, so anyone can kind of have a play around with it. Okay, so let's... what am I doing? Processes. So let's have process procs and then return procs. Right, done. We're done. Ship it. So now I should be able to just abstract away. I should be able to just, in fact, actually, I should be able to just take this and bring that into, nope, steady. Bring that into here. Don't need the namespace because I'm in it. Don't want to print. And then try creating the proc, and then if proc.name is equal to the name we suggest, then procs.pushback std move proc. So what this is going to basically do is go through all the PIDs. Sorry, got distracted. You're going to go through all the PIDs. For each one, it's going to try and create one of our process wrappers around it. It's then going to try and get the name of, using that wrapper, trying to get the name of the process. If that name matches the supplied name, it will then transfer ownership of that constructed process into the vector, and then we'll return all those at the end. What is C++? Probably don't have enough time to go through that at the moment. It's a high-level and low-level systems programming language that's been going for about 20 years and has significant baggage as part of that. But it's good fun. It's good fun. All right, now we'll go back to main, and then we can do for const auto proc in bio find process firefox.exe. So at this point in this loop, we know we only have valid processes mapping this string, so we don't have to worry about try catches or anything else. This is a much easier and more intuitive API for our users to use. It is not C with classes. So again, I'm glad I deleted this so I get to write it again. Let's do the name first this time, because they should all be the same, and then do PID. And boom, there we go, done. Okay, I'm quite pleased with that. I think this is a good place to stop. I didn't know how long I was going to stream for, but I knew I roughly wanted to get to this point. I'm happy to answer any other questions that come in for a little bit, but that's probably it for the programming segment of our show today. Will I make the name matching more fuzzy? I have no plans to, but that's certainly an extension we can do. I think I'm more interested in doing the low-level interaction than implementing like a fuzzy search. It might be a fun problem to do at some point, but I've got no plans to do it at the moment. Why didn't I clean up the H module? What's such a great question. I believe that is answered somewhere. I don't, because you are receiving a module to a part of the Windows API, so part of the Windows construct that already exists, you're effectively just getting a copy of that handle that Windows has already allocated internally, so there is no need to clean it up because it will still persist afterwards. I'm sure it says it somewhere in the docs, but for the life of me I cannot find it now. Oh no, I'm looking in the wrong place, that's why. Enum process modules. There you go. Right, straight from the docs. This is why you read all the docs, by the way. Enum process module, which was the function that we called. Blah, 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 blah. Do not call close handle on any of the handles returned by this function. The information comes from a snapshot, so there's no resource to be freed. So again, like Windows is, well, all programming at this level is kind of like this. You know, sometimes it does one thing, sometimes it does another, and all you've got to go on is the docs. Thanks, Richard, for coming along. See you off. I'm going to be heading off in a minute, but I'm hoping everyone enjoyed this. Why use C++ and not Python? It's a perfectly valid question. This is kind of like systems level programming. We want to be we want to be interacting with the operating system, and that is exposed as a first class feature through Windows' C API. And I know C++ better than I know C, so that's why we're going to do that. I probably know C++ a bit better than I know Python as well. If you were to do this in Python, you would effectively just be wrapping all the C functions and calling it through C types or through some other API. But I think there's quite a lot you can learn by doing this kind of low-level programming about the systems and the languages, so that's kind of why I'm going down that route. Is std move necessary before pushing a variable process to a vector? It is very much in this specific case because, remember, our auto-release is non-copyable, which means our process is non-copyable. So if you were to just try and... Proof isn't... This is the way it works, and I've totally misunderstood one. And I've absolutely no idea what I'm talking about. But if we just do this, it should... Yeah, you get a nice compiler error. Really verbose, because that's what C++ errors are like. Look at all this. All this to basically say you cannot copy this type. So somewhere in there, it's because the font's quite big. These are just all the different template. C++ gave it a really good go at trying to get this code to compile. Like, it gave it a really good go. It tried loads of things and basically gave up and said none of these are valid. Because you can't copy this, so I can't have a copy of this proc living outside of the vector. The only way to do it is to transfer ownership of this into this, and you do that with std move. Do I plan on going more content on the Iris game engine? Oh, great question. So Iris is the game engine that I started writing. It's actually what I started making YouTube videos on. It has languished in terms of any sort of effort or work on it, just because I don't have a huge amount of free time, and all the free time I do have has been taken up doing YouTube videos, not on Iris. If people are interested, I think that would be something we could do on a live stream. I'd love to get back into it. My plan for it is to basically gut all the rendering code because I hate it. And then just rewrite it all in Vulkan, probably. So maybe something we could do. Ah, thank you. Did it say the copy constructor was deleted? I just kind of get a bit blurred. After staring enough C++ compiler errors, they all merge into one. But yeah, that's effectively it. Do I have a day job? Yes. I do have a day job. I am a software engineer by trade. I spend a lot of my time teaching and training, though, especially C++, which is why I kind of like doing this as well. It's kind of like I guess it's kind of like doing my job for free. Okay, I am going to call it there. I've had an absolute great time doing this. I think we had 92 concurrent users, which is exactly 92 more people than I expected. So I'm absolutely totally blown away by that anyone even showed up to listen to me prattle on for an hour and a half on this. I plan on doing these semi-regularly. I have, as already discussed, I have a family and a job, so I'm semi-limited on free time, but any time I do get, I'm happy to jump back on and do some more of this. We'll add some interesting new features next time, and then I think after we've got a couple of features, we'll just reset the clock and try and redo it all in Linux, and then that's an interesting design choice in itself. But yeah, hope everyone has a good morning, evening, whatever time zone you find yourself in, and I will catch you in the next one.